I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as fears are sounded over the state of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, we hear how Princess Anne has made a surprise visit to Kyiv to demonstrate solidarity with Ukrainian children and families affected by the war. We report that French authorities have seized a Shadow Fleet tanker, and Polish police have arrested a Ukrainian man for the Nordstream 2 pipeline sabotage. And later, you'll hear my interview with the UN's Special Rapporteur for Torture, Alice Edwards. And a note, our discussion covers graphic descriptions of sexual torture.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 1st of October. 3 years and 221 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by India McTaggart, the Telegraph's royal correspondent. We started with the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start with the news from the front. Let's go into Ukraine. And last night, Russian forces launched a missile attack on the port of Izmail. That's over in the west. This comes from Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm. They report a single P-800 Onyx anti-ship cruise missile hit the port area there. Unconfirmed reports suggest the grain storage facilities and associated infrastructure had been damaged. So as of this morning, there was nothing reported about damage to merchant vessels. At the time of the incident, location data suggested there were 11 merchant vessels alongside or anchored in proximity to the port. Now, we need to talk about the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. It's been cut off from the electrical grid for the last 7 consecutive days. That's the longest such outage since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. So last night, President Zelensky said in his nightly address, he said it's now the 7th day, something that has never happened before, of an emergency situation at the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. Because of Russian shelling, the plant has been cut off from power, disconnected from the electrical grid, and is being supplied with electricity by diesel generators. This is extraordinary. He says the generators in the plant were not designed for this, have never operated in this mode for long, and we already have information that one generator has failed, he says. It is Russian shelling that prevents repair of the power lines, President Zelensky continued, power lines to the plant and the restoration of basic safety. This is a threat to everyone. No terrorist in the world has ever dared to do to a nuclear power plant what Russia is doing. And it is right that the world does not stay silent. Now, you'll remember Russia seized the plant soon after the full-scale invasion in 2022. Moscow claimed last week that it has been providing backup power since an attack that it blamed on Ukraine. The 6 reactors in Zaporizhzhia have been shut down since Moscow took the site, but the facility still requires electricity to maintain cooling and to prevent a nuclear incident. In a statement issued by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA chief Rafael Grossi said that the UN agency is, quote, in constant contact with the two sides with the aim to enable the plant's swift reconnection to the electricity grid. Mr. Grossi continued, while the plant is currently coping thanks to its emergency diesel generators, the last line of defence, his words, and there is no immediate danger as long as they keep working, it is clearly not a sustainable situation in terms of nuclear safety. Now, Margus Zahner, who's Estonia's foreign minister, he commented on Twitter this morning, nuclear safety is not a battlefield. The facility is surviving only on emergency diesel generators, a last line of defence never meant for long-term use. Russia must end its nuclear terror, end its occupation of Zaporizhzhia, and return the plant to Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine and support the International Atomic Energy Agency's efforts to restore off-site power. We will obviously keep a close eye. Sorry, this is me speaking now. We will obviously keep a close eye on the situation there. Now, across Ukraine, yesterday, 49 drones were fired overnight, as well as 4 Iskander-M or KN-23 ballistic missiles, KN-23 being the North Korean variant of the Iskander. That comes from Ukraine's Air Force. Ukrainian air defences shot down 44 of the 49 drones, while 5 missiles and 5 drones got through, struck several locations, leaving 5 dead and over 50 injured. On the ground, next to no move, which I know I say most days. However, I've got some stats for you today to back that up. Ukrainian monitoring group Deep State says today, so reported earlier today, the Russian troops captured approximately 100 square miles of Ukrainian territory last month in September. That is 0.04% of Ukraine's total area, the smallest monthly gain since May this year, and means in total that Russia now occupies about 19.04% of Ukraine's territory. So, maths are nice and easy. 30 days in September, 100 square miles. That is just about 3 1/3 square miles a day taken by Russia. So when I say next to no move in the Donbass and all that kind of stuff, we're looking at about 3 square miles, which I think in a country the size of Ukraine permits me to say next to no movement. It's also worth noticing, actually, terrible flooding after heavy rain has left 9 dead in Odessa, down in the south of the country. Rescuers worked through the night to evacuate people after almost a month's worth of rain fell in Odessa Oblast in just half a day. 362 people have so far been rescued. This comes from the State Emergency Service. But if you're down in Odessa, in that area, please do get in touch with us. Let us know, firstly, that you're safe, and secondly, what the situation is. Okay, before I move on to the diplomatic efforts, I should say I'm without Franco today. God knows where he is. Italy is sadly ill. I think Franco, they're both ill. Lack of moral fibre from Francis. No idea what's up with him. But delighted to turn to India. McTaggart, our royal correspondent. India, you've wrote a fascinating piece, Princess Anne, 5th in line to the throne?
Yes.
5th? Okay, 5th in line to the throne. That was a good guess.
I believe so.
She has a surprise visit to Kyiv. So what can you tell us about why Princess Anne was there and who she was chatting to?
So the Princess Royal has now become the 3rd senior royal to visit Ukraine. She was there to highlight the traumatic experiences of children living on the front line. It was an unannounced trip, obviously for security reasons, that happens. And she essentially went to demonstrate solidarity with Ukrainian children and families affected by the conflict, and of course to meet with President Zelensky. They discussed the UK's support for Ukraine and the ongoing resistance by the country, of course. As she shook Zelensky's hand yesterday, she told him she doesn't know how he has the time to spare, but she also handed him a sealed envelope with a red royal crest on the back, which probably contained a personal letter from the king, who he's obviously met on multiple occasions now. After their meeting, she then paid her respects at the Children's Memorial with Olena Zelenska, the Ukrainian First Lady, and they both left soft toys there. It was an important moment because the memorial commemorates the hundreds of children who have died since the invasion began in February 2022. And I think latest figures, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, show that nearly 3,000 children have been injured or killed since the outbreak of the war. But given the delay in verifying deaths, of course, the UN's warned this true number might likely be much higher. So the princess, there was a moment actually where she was looking at the teddies with the First Lady that are all assembled at the base of the memorial, and she turned around and told her that one of them was just like one that her daughter Zara Tindall had growing up. So it was a sort of poignant and emotional picture of the two mothers holding teddy bears and feeling the gravity of each sort of little life that memorial represents. Then Anne went on to meet with female police and armed force representatives in the capital to hear about their role in protecting women and children. And then she personally heard from children who have been returned to Ukraine to learn about their reintegration at the Child Rights Protection Center. So as of right now, we think that more than 19,500 Ukrainian children have been forcibly transferred or deported by the Russian authorities to Russia and the occupied territories of Ukraine.
Interesting stuff. Now, of course, she's not the only royal in recent weeks. Prince Harry popped up a couple of weeks ago. He was visiting superhumans, wasn't he, down in Lviv, I think. He was also in Kyiv, maybe elsewhere as well. But he went missing. We are told, when he was in Kyiv, and it was thought that he had a secret meeting.
Yes.
So what happened there? What's Harry been up to?
There's a secretive hour that was off the books, let's say. That was his second visit in 6 months to Ukraine. You were quite right. The first time he went to the Superhuman Centre in Lviv, and this time he went to the capital, and he also went again to celebrate the recovery and rehabilitation of wounded veterans. Of course, this is with his Invictus Games Foundation. So Zelensky is understood to be somewhat of a champion of the Duke's Invictus Games. games for wounded military personnel. And the pair were reported to have privately met, though I should add this was not confirmed by either side. But there was the suggestion that Harry had disappeared, as you say, for an hour, and that Zelensky had wanted to see him. So, of course, when you put two and two together, that is likely what he did. But, of course, the Foreign Secretary was there at the same time, and I think that the government wouldn't have wanted those two different visits to be overshadowed, if that makes sense, because her visit to her meeting with Zelensky was broadcast. But in any event, the Duke's Invictus Games has apparently become very well known in Ukraine, of course, because of the sheer number of wounded veterans. And Prince Harry himself is reportedly gaining a bit of a cult-like hero reputation there for what he has championed for veterans over the years. So I thought that was interesting. And I like the quote that he told The Guardian, who accompanied him on the trip: "We cannot stop the war, but what we can do is do everything we can to help the recovery process." So that's very much his MO when he's out there. And who knows when he might go next, but of course they're also very much surprise visits and reported to us after the event. The other member of the royal family to have visited Ukraine, and in fact the first to do so, was Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. So one of her remits is supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and this was a topic she discussed with President Zelensky and the First Lady during her visit, which was last April. She also paid her respects to those who have lost their lives, of course, and delivered a message to the President on behalf of the King, as Anne has just done as well.
Thank you. And just a couple more, actually. Well, I very rarely get to do a deep dive into the sort of royal stuff. So I've locked the door. You're not allowed to leave. Recent Donald Trump state visit. It was said that the King Charles had made some comment, or he was in some way a Trump whisperer. I don't know if this was done with the rose-tinted glasses of hindsight, because Donald Trump seems to have changed what he's saying, maybe not what he's necessarily doing that we know of. But do you buy into this King Charles as a Trump whisperer type thing?
So I think one cannot underestimate the sort of power, the diplomatic soft power of the royal family. I think we really much did see that in full swing during Trump's recent state visit last month. Of course, the king has been a very outspoken supporter of Ukraine since the outbreak of the war. And during the state visit, he's believed to have discussed the conflict in private meetings with Trump. So Mr. Zelensky's top advisor, his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, has since told The Telegraph that these talks were very important. They seem to have resulted in Trump departing from his previous insistence that Ukraine should give up territory to Russia to end the war. So I think it's an important example of the royal family's diplomatic soft power, as I said, actually being able to move the needle sometimes. And the king's speech at the state banquet with Trump could not have been clearer on his stance on the war, saying that tyranny once again threatens Europe and that us allies need to stand together to deter aggression and secure peace. So I think he probably did move the needle, and we know that Trump is very prone to, susceptible to flattery, let's say. And that was really what happened when we rolled out the red carpet for him.
No, fair enough. Interesting stuff. I do hope Harry, I don't know, it sounds very patronising, but he enjoyed his military service. We served at the same time. We were in the same squadron, although at different times. So I never met him while we were flying. But I do hope he finds some cause with Invictus. I know it's very close to his heart. And he's been a little bit, I don't know, lost, if that's too strong a word, in recent years. I hope, because the Ukrainian military are going to, because of the war, they're going to have one hell of an Invictus team. And I think if Harry is able to get stuck into that, it could do him and them a whole load of good. I don't know.
I think the plan is to get stuck into that. I understand Ukraine have already put in a bid to host Invictus Games as well. Okay. Of course, it's happening for the next time in London, but this is years ahead. So I think there is a clear cause that he is carving out through the Invictus Games Foundation, through travelling to Ukraine twice now. He did actually say in the interview that he held that this gives him a lot of purpose, and we know that his military service was very important to him. It's a huge part of his legacy. It's a huge part of what he champions now that he's no longer a working royal. But it's interesting because his sort of life is changing a lot at the moment. His approach is changing a lot. And I think he will actually undertake more of the royal style engagements that he used to do while in the family. He made clear that he wants to come to London more. And as I said, future trips to Ukraine, I'm sure, have not been ruled out because this is such an important cause to him. He really wants to champion the rehabilitation of wounded veterans.
Interesting stuff. Keen to get involved in any future visits, if the palace is listening. India, thank you so much. Just before we do the Diplo stuff, let's finish on the kind of military bits and bobs. Let's go into Russia. And the Russian oil pumping station Sukoldanya in the Rostov region, that's east of the Kerch Bridge, that kind of area, was attacked last night. According to NASA's FIRMS fire map, it's caused quite a large bit of damage there. The FIRMS, you'll remember, is the Fire Information for Resource Management System. It's basically a satellite-based system seeing where forest fires and other things are located. So if there's a refinery blast that can be seen from space, it's pretty big. And then also this morning, Russia's fifth largest oil refinery, the Yaroslavl oil refinery, is on fire. That's about 200 km north of Moscow. Local authorities called it a man-made incident, not connected to any drone attacks. So the Yaroslavl Oblast governor, Mikhail Yevarev, didn't clarify if the man-made nature of the incident was an accident or a deliberate act. But as of just before I checked before coming to you here, that was still on fire. Right then, now, before important royal update, I completely made a mess of it earlier on.
And sorry, I didn't quite know off the top of my head, so she's actually much
I only
further.
guessed. And is 17th in line to the throne, not 5th.
It's still a really significant visit, though. She is a very senior member of the royal family. She often undertakes engagements on behalf of the king, especially since his cancer diagnosis. So I think her actually going to the war zone, to the middle of the conflict, the heart of the conflict, is really important still.
Yeah, I just got my maths wrong. Sorry about that. Now then, let's go on to the diplomatic updates. EU leaders are gathering today in Copenhagen. This is the first meeting of the 27 leaders since June, when they last all got together in Brussels. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wants to discuss the EU's military ambitions, especially this plan for the drone wall that we've been talking about in recent days. This idea of how to protect Europe, eastern flank, front line, whatever you want to call it, the bit that borders Russia. Now, in an article yesterday, Politico said time is not on the EU side in this regard. Ukraine faces a budget shortfall of about $23 billion next year, giving EU governments just months to come up with a pot of cash of their own to sustain Kyiv's war effort and build this drone wall thing. Ms von der Leyen wants to use a €140 billion reparations loan financed by frozen Russian assets to do. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is thought to be standing in the way of the EU's plan to seize these assets, but the Commission thinks it's found a legal workaround to cut Hungary out of the decision-making process. So leaders are going to be discussing this plan today, and they hope to reach a formal decision at the second summit at the end of this month, according to Politico. One EU diplomat said the goal in Copenhagen is to gather sufficient support from other countries to isolate Orban. We're in the grey area. We'll put a link to the Politico story in the episode notes for today, and we'll hopefully bring some updates tomorrow about a readout from this EU meeting. Now then, in a possible indication of a more robust approach being taken by European authorities, possibly linked to that last story, French authorities are investigating a shadow fleet tanker off the coast of France today. The vessel, carrying over 100,000 tonnes of oil, is suspected of launching drones that shut down Copenhagen airport. Was it last week or the week before? The sanctioned shadow fleet tanker Boracay, that's an 18-year-old vessel currently using the Benin flag, but fraudulently, has been routinely using multiple fake identities, we're told, to carry Russian crude oil, and is one of 3 ships identified as possible launch points for these drones that closed Copenhagen's airport. Last week, closed the airport. So Lloyd's List provided more detail in this story. They understand that the vessel has not been formally detained and is currently anchored off Saint-Nazaire, while French authorities investigate what the French Navy described yesterday as an unspecified suspected violation. The prosecutor's office in Brest, where the formal report was lodged by the Navy, is understood to be investigating the tanker for lack of documentation of the ship's nationality and flag affiliation, as well as refusal to comply with the authorities' instructions. Now, the vessel, Boracay, rotated through multiple name changes and fake flags from Gambia, Malawi, and now Benin. This practice is well documented. The French investigation marks a significant move away from the previous hands-off monitoring of known to be fraudulently flagged shadow tankers by European states. So, as I say, potentially a more robust approach. As I said, Boracay was one of 3 ships with Russian links that were understood to be under investigation by Denmark after suspected drone sightings led Danish authorities to briefly close Copenhagen airport last week. The Danish government, however, did not move to detain any of the vessels, and while no details were released, it's understood that Danish security services are actively investigating the possibility that drones were launched from one of the three that were in the vicinity at the time of the attack. So the three were the Astral 1 that we talked about at the time. You remember Gaz and I, Gareth Caulfield, were tracking it on the, was it not Flight Radar, but whatever the maritime tracking website is that we use. But we were watching the Astral 1, had a Finnish Coast Guard helicopter go out and have a look. But also the Oslo Carrier 3 and the Boracay. These are the three ships that are on the naughty step at the moment. Although the Boracay was, at the time, listed under its previous name of Pushpa. Now, last July, this ship was damaged by one of those limpet mine explosions up in Russia, and she was also seized by the Estonian Navy in April earlier this year due to issues with registration and insurance. The tanker then was flying the flag of Djibouti, although Djibouti authorities denied any knowledge of the vessel whatsoever. It was some maritime permissions were given. Djibouti said it would accept the vessel. Some technical issues were sorted out, and then Estonia released the ship in April. Okay, now in possibly the greatest cosplay game the world has ever known, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, said yesterday that Ukraine is preparing to conduct a false flag attack in Poland in order to implicate Russia and Belarus. So this is the Russian spy service, the SVR, said that Ukraine's military intelligence and Polish intelligence are going to deploy a sabotage and reconnaissance group comprised of, okay, sit down, take notes, comprised of Russian and Belarusian nationals from the pro-Ukrainian Freedom of Russia Legion and the Kalinowski Regiment. Those are pro-Ukrainian Belarusians, going to deploy them to Poland. The SVR said that these pro-Ukrainian troops are going to conduct activities, then blame Russia and Belarus for any incidents. At the same time, this is the SVR warning, there's going to be attacks on critical infrastructure in Poland in order to heighten public outcry. How would they know? You may wonder. Anyway, the SVR said Ukraine is trying to take advantage of the recent drone incursions into NATO airspace to inflame anti-Russian sentiment in Poland and incite European countries to intervene in the war on behalf of Ukraine. So let's try and get our heads around this. So Russia is saying any sabotage action that happens in the near future isn't going to be done by pro-Russia Russians, but by pro-Ukrainian Russians, pretending to be pro-Russia Russians. And they're bringing this to the world's attention out of the goodness of their hearts in order to give Poland time to arrest the fake pro-Russia Russians who are actually pro-Ukraine Russians acting against Poland in order to support Ukraine. Still with me at the back? Okay. Now, of course, what's supposed to happen now is that we all go, oh my God, it's all so confusing. I can't be bothered to follow it. And then we say, what? Something's just exploded in Poland. Oh my goodness, I don't care. My head hurts. I'm not following it. So just watch out for something in Poland. And then I would be very cautious about saying those pesky Ukrainians have gone and blown up an electricity substation in Poland. But we will see. Maybe I'm doing the SVR a disservice. Ring me up, lads. Tell me if I've got you all wrong. Okay, a couple more from me. Authorities in Poland have arrested a Ukrainian man in connection with the bombing of the Nordstream 2 gas pipeline. Now, local media reports there name the suspect of Volodymyr Z, not giving his complete last name, a year after German prosecutors issued a warrant describing him as a diving instructor based in Poland. Who's this? Piotr Skiba, the Warsaw Regional Prosecutor's Office spokesman, speaking to the AFP news agency, said, I confirm he's been arrested. Procedures are underway. The man is suspected of being one of the divers said to have planted explosive devices in an operation that involved a married couple who ran a diving school. German authorities say that in September 2022, this suspect sailed to the Baltic Sea on a yacht called the Andromeda, from which he dived underwater and placed explosives on the pipeline. This comes from RMF-FM. The pipeline, which, as a reminder, for years had shipped Russian gas under the Baltic Sea to Europe, was damaged by these huge blasts. This was just months after the full-scale invasion. Now, some in the West were very quick to accuse Russia of carrying out the attack. It's long been disputed who was responsible and why. But German investigators now believe they've identified a Ukrainian cell of 5 men and 1 woman as the perpetrators. What their motivations are, who they work for, unknown. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal, the mission was first approved by Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't think that's the Volodymyr Z who's been arrested, just to confuse things further. So they say he originally approved it and then the operation was called off. But despite this, again, this is the Wall Street Journal saying, Despite this, the operation went ahead under orders from General Valery Zaluzhny, who was the head of Ukraine's military at the time. He's now Kyiv's ambassador to the Ukraine. A spokesperson for Ukrainian president has denied all of that. Now, the lawyer Tibetches Proporky confirmed the arrest of his client, this Ukrainian individual, but did not identify him by name. He said, in the morning hours, my client was detained in one of the towns near Warsaw as a result of a European arrest warrant, which was issued by the German side and pertains to matters related to Nordstream 2. He was speaking to Polish broadcaster TVN24. Connected to all this, earlier this month, an Italian court ordered another Ukrainian, an individual called Sergei Kuznetsov, who's 49 years old, said he was arrested over the sabotage and should be extradited to Germany to face charges. When he was arrested, German prosecutors said Mr. Kuznetsov had used a forged identity document to charter a yacht, which departed from the German city of Rostock to carry out these attacks. After the start of the full-scale invasion, you'll remember Western governments imposed sanctions on Moscow, which then Moscow then switched off the gas flow in Nord Stream 1, and Nord Stream 2 never got into operation. But then in September 22, there were underwater blasts and 4 gas leaks were discovered just off the Danish island of Bornholm. Gas spewed up on the surface. Remember those very dramatic images, those photographs. 2 of the leaks were in Denmark's exclusive economic zone, 2 in Sweden's, hence the kind of dual, the investigation at the time. It sort of flick-flacked between Denmark, Sweden, Germany got involved as well. Underwater investigations since showed that a near 50-metre hole in the Nord Stream 1 gas duct, it's been ripped apart. World leaders have described the incident as an act of sabotage, and the investigation and the confusion and the speculation has been going on ever since. So we will, again, track that one. Now then, we've got a pre-record interview today. Last week, I interviewed Alice Edwards, who's the UN's United Nations Special Rapporteur for torture, inhuman and other degrading treatment. She's just about to give her annual report to the UN on alleged torture in Ukraine by Russia, overwhelmingly by Russian forces, although she has investigated allegations of torture by Ukrainian forces as well. So she's about to present her report. It's on October the 15th. But she, alongside the report, she writes a letter each year to the Kremlin to say, would you like to answer these allegations? And every year the Kremlin ignore her. Anyway, so I interviewed her last week, and that pre-record is going out on today's podcast. So we're going to draw the stumps now, keep it a little bit shorter today. We'll go to final thoughts. And you got any final thoughts?
I'd really just recap what I said, and I think it's really important to notice and to appreciate the soft diplomacy that the royal family can actually undertake on behalf of the government. We know that all these trips to Ukraine are either at the request of the Foreign Office or, in Harry's case, of course, because he's no longer a working royal, just with the approval of the British government. But it can actually really significantly move the needle. And I think the King's ongoing and very outspoken support for Ukraine and for our country as an ally to keep supporting Ukraine has been really significant. And hopefully, yes, will move Donald Trump's positioning as well as it seems to have already.
Thank you. I'm looking sceptical because I can't believe our Princess Anne is 17th in line. That can't be right. Anyway, I
think there might have been a new baby that overtook her, and she might have gone down to 18. It's an ever-changing.
I'm going to quit while I'm not ahead on this one. So, for my final thought, folks, bear with me, please, if you wish. I've been asked by a number of people said they'd be interested in my thoughts on Pete Hegseth's speech yesterday. So, US Secretary of War gave his speech yesterday at Quantico, the Marine base in Virginia, to an assembled crowd of senior officers and enlisted personnel. I was asked for my thoughts, for what they're worth. So I will offer you some thoughts, if I may, because I think it's an important moment. It is worth watching back if you can. I wouldn't necessarily watch the Donald Trump bit afterwards. He spoke for about 40 minutes. I'm not trying to diss the president there. I'm just saying actually what Pete Hegseth, he was giving the direction of travel. So that's the bit to really focus on. Worth watching back, or just have a look at the transcript on the Pentagon website. So he kept talking about the warrior ethos, and he was saying things like common sense is back. All good phrases. Any conversation like this, I bet my common sense is very different to yours, and I bet ours is very different to that person stood over there, and his over there, and hers over there, and they're over there. So common sense is very easy to say, oh, common sense. But actually, what do we mean by that? I thought some of the language was quite loose and needed a lot of tightening up, because a lot of assumptions assumption is the mother of all cock-ups. So it's quite dangerous language in some places. I was surprised at some of the criticisms he made about the US military. It didn't, to my eyes, didn't describe the US folks that I served with. I was chatting throughout the speech with a mate of mine in the US connected to the military. Not serving, don't worry, but connected to. And my friend did point out that actually for much of my experience in the military, certainly the last decade or so, was hanging around airborne and special forces units, a groupie like that. So I was probably unsighted to much of what Pete Hegseth was complaining about. However, I didn't like his comments about hazing, bullying, the toxic culture. When he said it's okay to put hands on recruits in a positive way. My view on this stuff is radioactive. Okay, this mentality needs really strong leadership to ensure that it doesn't turn into a bully's charter. It is only 20 years since Abu Ghraib. That was a very dark point in recent US military history. Same for the British Army over the murder of Baha Musa. It was only 20 years ago that these things happened. Pete Hegseth said, pacifism is naive and dangerous. It ignores human nature and it ignores human history. Mr. Hegseth, if I may, I've just reminded you of a bit of the US's recent human history and what it says about human nature. So please be careful. I think you'll be naive to suggest that those demons are all excised and that these possible behaviours do not still lurk just below the surface in some people. You recruit from the society you serve. When you refer to, as he did in his speech, to the broken windows theory of policing and said, if you let the small stuff go, the big stuff eventually goes as well. I ask, what is the small stuff when it comes to personal morality and the courage needed to stop oneself from bad behaviours, let alone one's mates or the chain of command? Pete Hegseth said, of course, you can't do nasty bullying and hazing. So again, I sat up at this point, who defines nasty? So you're saying bullying is okay, but nasty bullying is not okay? This is dangerous territory if you don't make it absolutely clear. He said that recruit training instructors he will allow shark attacks. These are where groups of instructors stand around and yell at recruits to simulate the noise and chaos of combat. So they can do shark attacks, they can toss bunks, so do a room inspection and chuck all the stuff all over the place. They can swear. I've got no massive issue here, but again, be careful. Where's the line? But then he said, and yes, this is recruit instructors, they can put their hands on recruits. Okay, at this point, for me, big red flashing warning light. Mr. Hegseth, I've been through some very rough handling. I've been interrogated through training. I was a trained interrogator myself. I have served in units designated prone to capture, which, as an aside, I always thought was a little bit of a backhanded compliment. This unit's prone to capture. So, all right, steady, doing our best. Bloody hell. Anyway. At the risk of sounding patronising, this is really difficult stuff to get right. I'm not saying you can't, but go back to those comments about human nature, human history, all that kind of stuff. So putting your hands on recruits, hazing, not allowing nasty bullying, you're playing with kryptonite here. He said, I don't want my son serving alongside troops who are out of shape. There was a lot of, he seems to be a man very focused on his biceps, kept talking about PT and all this sort of stuff and fat generals can't serve and what have you. But I think that kind of thing is too sweeping a statement. Mr. Hegseth, would you be unhappy if your son served alongside a Marine who had lost both legs in combat, but who was now a kick-ass drone pilot? What about a thin slip of a 20-year-old female flying drones top cover for a logistic resupply? Would you be happy with that? I think overall he just about got away with the tone and the message. It was a bit patronising, a bit hectoring. He flirted with permitting bad behaviours, allowing bad behaviours to creep back in, as I said. But I thought the central message was sound. A lot of work now needed to make it land correctly. I was left with the impression that if things have got that bad in the US military, then it must be quite a really bad way and strong leadership is required. So I agreed with comments like, the job is life or death, so standards must be met. I agree with things like you don't necessarily always belong in polite society, as in soldiers about to go into combat. I agree when he said, in other words, to our enemies, FAFO, fuck about, find out. I didn't like his dig, quote, the media will mischaracterise us. I thought that was a little bit needy, a bit playing the victim. Not all of us are like that, Mr. Hegseth. You give us the access, and I think we can both win. That is access that I didn't see in Alaska, and not just because of the toxic attitude, and I do use that word deliberately, toxic attitude of the White House Correspondents Association. Mr. H, you've really got to do something about that bunch. I don't mean then to get them to sign something saying they promise they're not going to be mean to you, but they do your country and your administration no favours with their sense of entitlement at these press events. But I think if you trust your people, they will tell the most brilliant stories to us and we'll do our job and then we'll both win. I agree with much of what Pete Hegseth said yesterday, but there's a huge amount of work to do on the leadership side to make it land correctly, as I say. Make one final point, if I may. A commander I once worked for, in his earlier career, had led a very tricky hostage rescue operation that was going to be nasty. It was going to be bad, and it was. It worked, but not everybody came back. I was not there, but friends of mine who were said his last words in the O group, in the orders group, before launching men to go and kill other men were, "Come off target, morally intact." And I think that's a pretty good handrail. War is a nasty and brutalising activity, as we know. Training for it has to be realistic and therefore hard. So if I'm able to offer any advice at all to the US Secretary of War, Mr. Hegseth, I would say this: please impress upon your people at all levels of the chain of command and through every aspect of military activity, come off target, morally intact. I think that's about as good a handrail as you could hope for. Alice Jill Edwards has been the UN's Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment since 2022. Her mandate covers all countries, irrespective of whether a state has ratified the Convention against such activity. She regularly conducts fact-finding missions and reports at least once a year formally to the United Nations. On Monday, the 29th of September, her most recent letter of allegation to Russia covers a dossier of 10 selected cases of torture, and especially sexual torture against civilians in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. The dossier relates the treatment experienced by 4 female and 6 male victims in 3 regions of Ukraine. Alice, thank you so much for coming into the Telegraph and talking to Ukraine the latest. You say evidence is mounting of Russian tactics of sexual torture against Ukrainian civilians. What evidence have you found?
So first of all, thanks so much for having me on again, Dom. I think the podcast is great to keep the exposure high on this terrible war. What I have sent 60 days ago to the Russian Federation is another dossier of cases, of which I had received 80 allegations, separate cases of forms of torture that included sexual brutalization across 3 regions, Kherson, Kyiv and Zaporizhzhia. And from that larger dossier, I selected 10 to present a pattern of evidence to the Russian authorities.
What has been the response to your previous such letters of allegation to the Russian Federation?
Disappointingly, the Russian Federation has not engaged with my mandate. They have refused a country visit. I've requested on a number of occasions to be able to visit detainees in situ, both in occupied territories of Ukraine, but also within Russia itself. So one may ask, what is all the documentation for? Why do I keep writing to the Russian Federation? And I think it's really important for victims and survivors to have their material documented by an official. And justice always comes. It may come very late, but the goal here is to keep the focus on these terrible violations, put pressure on Russia to stop them, as well as for the victims and survivors to at least have that small sense that someone cares and that someone is documenting these cases for use in later potentially trials or other forms of compensation that may be paid to those victims, survivors and their families.
Of course, it's important to document these occurrences and cases for the historical record. How confident are you that you will be able to achieve more than just documenting what has happened?
I think at this stage that is unclear. There are 2 things maybe I can say about it. The Council of Europe mechanisms have been quite active. They've established register for damage for Ukraine. It also includes now cases of torture, inhumane treatment, sexual violence, abduction of children, and so forth. So they are doing a good job in recording people's claims and telling individuals how they're able to make claims for violations of the laws of war. The other mechanism is this International Claims Commission, which will be in the form of a treaty where states will participate in that to provide reparations for loss and damage caused during the war, including for torture. So how confident am I? I think at this stage, there's a lot of recording of information, a lot of forensic evidence being gathered for later prosecutions. The Ukrainian authorities are carrying out prosecutions at this time, in real time, which I have to say is quite remarkable. There are very few conflicts in the world where the gathering of evidence is happening as the war is going on, and also prosecutions happening at the same time. So that is quite unique. Ultimately, any peace settlement must also entail obligations for the parties to participate and to adhere to any tribunals set up to establish justice after the fact.
A couple more of the wider context. Talking about that route to justice, you've been blocked, you've been refused access by Russia. Is there any point in trying to work through other countries that might lean more towards Russia? I'm thinking Hungary, Slovakia, South Africa, China, Venezuela even. Is it possible? Are there other routes that you might be able to influence Russian behaviour?
Look, I think in the context of ending the war and the peace negotiations, clearly any levers that can be used should be used. My view is that torture is a hindrance to peace. The widespread and systematic use by Russia of torture and other inhumane acts is definitely going to hinder good relations in the future. However, and as you say, these other actors, actually a couple of them you've mentioned, have put up their hand to assist with the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. I understand nothing as at this stage has come of that. However,
sorry, in the general peace process or specifically on these allegations of torture and
on the
treatment?
general peace process. However, that was pre-Trump. So now, of course, the players have changed and there is a greater push for a resolution to this war. However, what I'm worried about is that the discussions at this point in time are only about territorial exchanges and security guarantees, and they're not about justice for all the victims and survivors.
Can any negotiated settlement be achieved without reparations and justice being an integral part? Is it at all possible?
For real peace to take hold, there needs to be this sense of justice and repair. There are many international standards on this. Whether that happens within the peace process, which I think it should form part of it. There may also be cases where Russians are able to make allegations against their treatment, that they may be able to put forward cases of torture and ill treatment. But we have to have a short and a long-term view on what peace actually entails. And these countries are living side by side. The future has to be both at the people-to-people level but also at the state level. There is an understanding and a reckoning for what happened and a commitment not to repeat it. And I think all of the research shows that anyone who's been subjected to torture, and when it's on such a widespread scale that it's affecting all members of society, that there has to be some way in which there's repair for what has been committed. That may include compensation, it may include other things that the victims want, such as plaques or memorials or just the bodies back to bury their loved ones. So there's quite a lot to it. I think my advice for the governments attempting to negotiate the peace is that they may need to play this card later, but absolutely they need to play the card and put it on the table that this has to be part of the peace negotiations.
Now, I've not seen the letter of allegation. At the time of recording, it's not yet public, so I've not seen the 10 cases that you've covered in there. But there was a shocking story in the last few days with a video. SBU, so the Security Service of Ukraine, radio intercepts from the Liman area, which were put together with a video from an alleged Russian channel showing a family that was killed, all except for a little girl who was then taken hostage and used as some form of human shield. We know from this footage the Russian commander, who had a call sign of Barley, was issuing instructions to kill civilians. Is this in line with what you've seen in the past?
The scale is really off the charts about how many people who are detained are subjected to some form of degrading or inhuman treatment, but also it seems very organised. So people and victims are able to recount who took them from their homes or who picked them up. They're able to recount who was detaining them, the role of the detaining authorities. They were able to say who were the torturers versus who were the interrogators. And certainly Russian security forces are all part of that, as well as the armed forces. What this new cache of documents shows is that this isn't limited to torture against combatants, but that the civilian toll is also extremely high. And within that, sexual torture is being used also at such frequency that it also must be a permissible part of the torture, and that torture remains part of, in my view, Russian war tactics and war policy.
You've amassed a huge wealth of data here, Russia-Ukraine war and elsewhere around the world. Is what you're seeing here, and in particular the sexual torture, is that the level that you would expect given the amount of activity and the number of people involved and the time? Is this an aberration, or is this what is seen in human conflict?
Torture is absolutely prohibited under international law. That means there are no exceptions for torture, no statutes of limitations on prosecutions, no immunities for heads of state or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the General of the Army, no amnesties for any of these acts. Everyday people understand that torture is prohibited, let alone people that have been trained in the Russian military. So it is systematic, and it is Russian military policy. Russia tells us they have very disciplined troops, so they follow orders. Even the defence of superior orders is not a defence for the crime of torture. It may be for some other crimes, it's not for the crime of torture. The scale and level, it's not a few rogue individuals. It's really very systematic, and the purposes for it are quite clear. Sometimes it's to obtain intelligence, information. There have been video recordings of people being forced to sign confessions to be later used as a form of blackmail to keep them loyal to the Russian authorities in those areas, and simple things such as to instill fear in the population. It is, in my view, so clear-cut now, and at no time have I seen directives from the hierarchy for Russian soldiers and others to stop torturing. That's what I've asked for, and those directives do not exist.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the individuals that you spoke to? It must be exceptionally brave for them to offer this advice. They must be I'm imagining, very traumatised individuals and going back over some very disturbing memories and material. How did you find them, and did they feel it was their duty to speak up? How much encouragement did you have to offer them in order to get the evidence you did?
So I work with a number of organisations on the ground who have daily contact with victims and survivors. I also think on the Ukrainian side, they've done an excellent job of receiving back anyone who's been freed from the occupied areas, who may have been in prisoner exchanges. They have a very positive treatment process where people are not only given physical medical care, and many of them need it, but also longer-term psychological assistance from qualified experts. And so within that context, and also working with these local organisations on the ground who are bringing victims and survivors and giving them the opportunity to document their cases, there is, I think, a sense of safety in numbers, but also safety in the sense of they are receiving treatment as they go. I mean, in interviewing many victims and survivors of torture across the world, the ones that who have left on their own, who don't have any support networks, when you speak to them, their stories are all over the place. They haven't been able to process what has happened to them. They haven't been able to make sense of it. And it can be a very illogical passage through what has happened. And in contrast, when you do provide these kind of safe and secure environments, these people are mostly being interviewed outside those areas, so they are in relative safety in other parts of Ukraine, that they're able to better articulate what has happened to them. The documentation is detailed about dates and times and places. And just to emphasize, these are civilians. So that's a roundabout way to say it's very complicated for people to tell their stories. I think there is a sense of solidarity about why they should. The cases I have that I put forward, only 2 are named. The others are all anonymised. They must consent to having their information presented because it's not just being provided to me, it's also going to the Russian authorities. One of the individuals, a young woman, is still detained in Russian-occupied territory. We understand now she's been moved into Russia itself. And so she is named not for the public record, but for the hope of being able to get the Russians to release her or exchange her in prisoner exchanges.
How are you able to verify the information you're given? The example you just gave there, how are you able to speak to this woman if she's still in Russian captivity?
And first of all, we spend a long time, and the organisation spend a long time interviewing these people. You know, is there a coherent story? Have they been able to, are we able to verify that they do say they come from that place and they have been taken to that place, etc.? Is there consistency in the story? Some, of course, will have medical reports, and there is a specialised area of forensic science relating to torture. There's an international manual called the Istanbul Protocol, which is about how to document torture, physical but also psychological, but physical in particular, torture, to be credible and compatible with what the individuals have said.
So just on that, so if someone alleges I was hit by a metal bar on the upper arm repeatedly, there's corresponding physical evidence you should expect to see from that.
So these forensic experts, it is important that they are part of the process in Ukraine, that there is a level of physical checking as well as mental checking. Of course, that's always complicated by the fact that I also have information from past research on these cases that prior to prisoner exchanges, Russia is moving those that are to be exchanged to better facilities for 2 weeks prior to their departure, in which case most bruises, so the more superficial, will disappear. Of course, things like broken limbs, burns from electrocutions on parts of the body potentially will also remain if people have been shot, etc. That will be able to be determined. And these forensic experts, they'll be able to tell you whether it's a self-inflicted knife wound or whether it came from outside, etc. It doesn't mean that if you don't have this physical evidence that there wasn't torture, because torture from the Russians includes things like mock suffocations, mock executions, drowning simulations. So all of those will not produce physical evidence. For people who have pre-existing illnesses, they may suffer heart attacks. Quite a number of the individuals reported losing consciousness, and those kind of things are harder to find the physical evidence of. But it's important, as I said, to remember that victims of torture don't all have scars. Often the scars are psychological and clearly long-term. And in terms of that, the female case who remains in Russian captivity, it's her mother who has been giving us the information and has had some correspondence with her. So there are stages in these detentions where the Russians may allow family members to be informed about where they are and sometimes to deliver food packages. Normal detention regimes will allow family, and they must be informed immediately. They should be registered. There's a full way of procedure that should automatically be followed.
Through the ICRC? International Committee
well,
of the
yes,
Red
the
Cross?
ICRC should be able to have access to all these people, but they don't. But the authorities themselves, anyone who's detained, they have a right, family to be informed, to access a lawyer, to have their whereabouts known, to be registered in a detention register, and other safeguards around their whereabouts so there aren't forced disappearances. What we have in Russia is they do that occasionally. They do it potentially as a reward rather than as an ordinary procedure, and it's certainly not done adequately. So the mother has had some access to her daughter, and it's the daughter's story recounted through the mother. So I can't say too much more about that because she is still detained.
Now, we hear that in the occupied territories of Ukraine, there are these pre-trial detention centres where people are held initially, and then many are also then moved on to Rostov and sentenced in Rostov. Do you have any access to either of these things? Does any international organisation, the International Committee of the Red Cross, any other UN body have access to these pre-trial detention centres or Rostov? And are these the areas where torture is taking place, or is it further along the chain?
The evidence seems to point that this is happening in all places. It's potentially higher in the early phases of being detained, where people's detention hasn't been registered yet, that it's uncertain what the detention is for. There are also a lot of releases of people out having been detained for sometimes up to 9 months with no prosecutions happening, because these are not criminal arrests. These are just picking up people for various military-style reasons and just to instill fear, and for the population, I believe, not to become complacent, to have a constant worry, and not to provide, for example, intelligence to the Ukrainians, not to show any loyalty, to Russify these areas and to ensure that everybody is loyal to the Russian state.
Now, I think in your latest letter of allegation, you focus on the sexual nature of the torture. Is that because you've seen an increase in that type of activity, or just to highlight it as it's been going on all the time? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so in my visit in October 2023, one of the areas that I wasn't able to explore adequately was around the extent of sexual torture within the Russian-occupied areas. And that was purely because of the time frame in which I was able to be in the country for security reasons. So this is, in a way, a continuation of that work, and organisations on the ground, as victims and survivors have become more confident, they understand that their information will remain confidential, that there's some reason for telling the story, that there will be justice potentially one day. These stories have been coming out. One of the things that I stress is that this is sexual torture within a context of torture. All of the cases involved all different forms of beatings, egregious, humiliating ceremonies, degrading nudity, these types of torture. And within that, there were threats of rape, either against the person directly or against someone else. There were allegations of rapes themselves, including one person alleging that they were raped on the very first day, and also the use of, say, non-sexual torture in a sexual way. So beatings of genitals, electrodes to genitals, mock castrations, these types of things that are very sexualizing torture for the purpose of really degrading and escalating the torture to a level that becomes it's just very graphic and very grisly, and how people withstand that and get their lives back together afterwards is absolutely remarkable to me. And this was against, as I said, civilians in all of the cases.
Do you have enough evidence to name alleged perpetrators?
That's the complexity of this. I don't. Many times people are blindfolded when they're being tortured. As I said, this system of kind of who detains them versus who's interrogating them versus who's beating them, often from behind, for example, people losing consciousness, that is a real challenge. But from my own research, no, I don't have enough information on specifically named individuals. I have some individuals who've been able to give code names of people, etc., which over time hopefully will be triangulated, also with official sources of who was running those detention facilities when the areas become liberated.
Have you also heard of and investigated allegations of torture made against Ukrainian authorities?
So there are allegations. The Commission of Inquiry, which is a 3-member UN body, and the UN mission in Ukraine have identified quite a number of cases of torture by Ukrainian soldiers against Russian soldiers, not civilians, because this is in the war context. And those also need to be well documented, and perpetrators need to be brought to account. I haven't been able to obtain, to my own level of satisfaction, whether that material is divided between torture and other forms of ill treatment. And I have been pushing the UN office in Ukraine to be making clearer distinctions. Sometimes that's complicated because torture and inhuman treatment are being perpetrated together. However, it is really important that one assesses the intensity and duration and the level of suffering. The distinction between torture and other forms of ill treatment is that torture is a severe form of pain or suffering. So it's at the higher level. I'm really talking about a policy of torture that is being perpetrated by the Russian Federation. And then other crimes, because eventually these will need to be properly tagged for the purpose of prosecution. So yes, there are allegations, and they are usually being under the torture and inhuman treatment by Ukrainians, from my own evidence, is being conducted upon capture and prior to being put in detention facilities. That's quite worrying, and for that I think the Ukrainians need to do some work with their own security forces, and I am in conversations with them also to make sure that that happens.
Have you found any form of obstruction from the Ukrainian authorities in your work?
No, I have a lot of obstruction from a lot of states in the work that I do. I would say I'm probably one of the least popular of these investigators. However, the Ukrainians have an open door policy. When I was in Ukraine, I made unannounced visits to any place of detention that I wanted to without prior notice to the government, and the door remains open. I would like to see that same level of openness by the Russian Federation.
Now, before I ask you what's going to happen with this latest letter and what the UN may or may not do afterwards, coming towards the end, are there any issues that we've not touched on today that we should have done, or any areas that you think need highlighting from your letter that we've not brought out?
The only other issue that I think is particularly troubling is that international humanitarian law doesn't provide for exchange of civilians. And this is because civilians should not be detained in the context of war. And so we do see some civilians being exchanged in these prisoner exchanges, but it is a strange dynamic of this war that so many Ukrainian civilians are being detained. And so this letter was also to very much highlight the civilian aspect of the military policies of Russia.
Now, what's going to happen to this letter of allegation? You're presenting at the UN on the 15th, I believe, of October. So what is the process from here on in? What action will the UN take?
At this stage, I will continue to document as many cases as I can and put those cases to the Russian Federation. As I said, it may seem disappointing, but it's a really, really important part of the process. And just to give you an example of why it is, the Netherlands and Canada have brought a case against Syria before the International Court of Justice. And in that case, I was able to put together a full position paper on over 13 years of documentation by myself, but also my predecessors in this role, and submit it to the court and to the parties in that case. So there is hope for victims and survivors that there will be recognition of the harm that has been caused to them, and hopefully accountability for the perpetrators. And in the case of the Russian perpetrators, it's not only on an individual level, because this is widespread and systematic, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. It is at the level of the state. It's Putin himself and Lavrov who have responsibility for these types of policies, and the Russian state itself will be held accountable. Yes, I'm speaking to the General Assembly. In my report to the General Assembly, which is also now public, I do have a big section on torture in wartime, and I regret to be reporting that it is just escalating. I'm very worried that as a broad international community, we've lost the global commitment to and ability to solve some of the world's newer, but also these protracted armed conflicts. And what is common to all of these armed conflicts is the use of torture. And it's not good enough to say, well, this is something that happens in wartime when people have adrenaline running through their bodies and they've been trained to believe the enemy are these other people. I think it's really important that we go back to basic principles and that states really remember why they joined the UN Charter in 1945, and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where the prohibition on torture was one of the unanimously agreed prohibitions at that time in 1948. It's incredibly eerie being in Ukraine and walking through prisoner of war camps, and then you're informed by the Ukrainians actually, it was one of the prisoner of war camps from 1945. So it's a very strange era we're in, where we seem to have, in my view, we need to remember why we have the United Nations, why we have these prohibitions, that they are sacred and significant, and the only way we can live together as human beings across borders, different political views, different religions, is if we treat each other with dignity. And at the base of the prohibition of torture is that everyone deserves dignified treatment. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is really showing us the worst of humanity, throwing out the rule book. And I remain available to the parties, but also the broader UN, to be involved in peace negotiations. We need to keep pushing for peace and the end to these atrocities.
Alice Edwards, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Thanks very much, Dom. Appreciate it.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.